This is Grand Admiral Thrawn, and you are listening to Rule the Galaxy. A wise decision, one that will be met confidently on the battlefield.
Hey, Star Wars fans and Rule the Galaxy fans. It is Joe in the pilot seat of chapter 279 of the Rule the Galaxy podcast. It's one of our favorite things to do, one of those side shows we do where it's just me and a guest. And, before I jump into our special guest for today, I will say, as always, like, follow, subscribe, smash the like buttons, everything that all those influencers tell you to do that on our YouTube or on your podcast platform of choice. And, let us know what you think. Also, leave comments and reviews. But here in chapter 279 of the Rule of the Galaxy podcast, we are honored to have Mr. Trevor Davey, who is the author of, or he compiled the book, The Unofficial Definitive Legends Timeline. And as most of you know, I'm a huge Legends fan. So we're glad to have him here. Trevor, how are you, sir?
I'm very well. Thanks for having me on and giving me a chance to talk about this crazy book.
Yeah. No, I wouldn't have missed it for the world. And I want to thank some of our listeners. I know some of our listeners put it together and reached out to you and said, "Hey, you should go and rule the galaxy." And then you and I started talking. So we really appreciate it. And we like to give our listeners and our followers different aspects, different varieties. Obviously, we talk week to week of what's on live action. We occasionally have guests on who were authors, who are voice actors, or artists, things like that in the Star Wars universe. But we definitely wanted to have you on because I think most of our hosts. Let's see, I'm 53. My cousin's almost 50. One of their hosts is in his 40s, and then we have the baby of our host who's 32 or 33 years old. So he doesn't know the legends like we do, I guess. But some of us have been voracious readers since the late 70s. And so it was really cool to see what you've compiled, what you put together, and actually hear more about the work you put into it. So I see that you are part of utini.com. Is that correct?
I am indeed. So it won't surprise you to know that I manage the timelines over at Houdini.com.
Gotcha. And then you're the co-host of the Star Wars Archives pod.
Yes, so Star Wars Archives, I host it with my good friend Jose Jimenez, and we've always focused on the more obscure corners of Star Wars publishing,
Okay.
which again, you'll see a ton of in this book as well. We've done episodes on Jaxxon or the Jedi Prince series, or, the things that other people generally aren't talking about.
Okay. Well, that's good. I mean, we talk about it all the time on our show that there's different entry points for every Star Wars fan, whether it's timing wise or medium wise, right? Like some people came in because of video games, some people came in because of Legos, some people came in because of the original trilogy. So
100%.
yeah, so you having the obscure little parts, I'm sure there's somebody who got some youth book back, in the 80s that caught their attention and brought them into Star Wars, right? So I like that you're approaching it from that point of view.
I can imagine somebody who would, again, they'd be around our age, because I'm 47, their first entry to Star Wars being the Who Give Menace read-along cassette book.
Well, and I used to have, and I'm sorry as people get to see my bald head as I'm doing this interview with you here, but I used to have probably, I don't know, 5 bookshelves just completely filled with Star Wars. But I've gone to a lot more audio than the hard copies.
Yeah.
But I'm sure you probably have some points in your book related to
Oh, yeah.
Mystery of the Rebellious Robot and Droid World. So
Yep, absolutely.
You've talked about them on your podcast, I'm guessing, or are they just in the book?
We've definitely mentioned the picture books, because that's actually one of my favorite formats of Star Wars books that's ever existed, the 6x4 picture book.
Yes.
Because there's so many of them. You know, they had them for the droids and Ewoks cartoons. They're still using them for the High Republic. There's a history all of their own with those books.
I used to love nothing more than being a little kid between the movies and saying, I'm going to go put my cassette tape on or my album on and have my little book to read along with it. That was so much fun. When we didn't have access to the movie 24/7, 365, you know, we didn't have VHS tapes at the time. That was another one of those ways we kept involved outside of the comics and so forth. So, last thing I want to mention here real quick. Oh, no, I did. I mentioned the Star Wars podcast. So I apologize for that. How long have you been doing that podcast, by the way?
I think we're up to about 3 years now on the podcast.
Okay. All right.
So we're coming up to our 100th episode.
Good for you. That's
obviously not a patch on you guys at 279.
Well, you know, it's amazing. My co-hosts, a lot of times I brought them each one-time thing, and here we are this many episodes in. We've had some hosts leave, some hosts show up, and now we've got a core group of 4 who are pretty much involved every week. It's been a lot of work. I did not expect it to be that much work. So I know, hey, I give you props, because even getting to 100 episodes, I think I remember when I first started this, somebody said if you get to 50 episodes, you know, you've done something. So you getting to 100.
It's like 3% of podcasts get to 20 episodes or something like that.
Wow. I can only imagine how many podcasts are out there sitting in the teens. Let's start with your fandom. Obviously, before we even get into the book, your fandom, you're 47 years old. Obviously, you're with utini.com. You have a podcast. Where was your entry point? What started your love and passion for Star Wars that made you still want to be involved with it this many years down the road?
I don't remember a time that I wasn't obsessed. So I don't remember the first time I saw the movies. I don't remember when I got my first toys. I don't remember when I first read the UK weekly comic, the adaptation or the reprint of a Marvel series. Mm-hmm. It's just always been there. So when the memories start, really, when you're 3 or 4. So at that age, I must have already been obsessed, because I don't remember a time before Star Wars in my life. There's a great photo of me, and I must be 8 or 9 years old, and I'm in my bedroom holding the Kenner Millennium Falcon, and you can see Return of the Jedi, curtains, bedspread, wallpaper. You can see jigsaws, you can see the comics, you can see the toys. It's just always been there, and it's never gone away.
You know, it's a fun time to think back about that, and I know I'm old enough now that I have grandkids, and I have them come over and play with some of my old Star Wars toys, the beaters that, you know, I didn't put away.
Spares.
Right? Yeah, that's right. The extras, the spares. And I see them, and I love to watch their eyes light up when they're picking up a ship and pretending like it's going through space, or taking little guys and make them look like they're having a lightsaber battle. And to think that we lived through that original part of it, right? And we were, that's that whole part of the community and society that changed when that hit theaters and when that hit the just the world in general. It's just amazing to look back at that and think, and I'm pretty sure I have probably a similar picture like that of me somewhere. Yeah. And I think maybe that could be a good coffee table book, is have everybody send you their photo from, you know, back in the late 70s, early 80s, surrounded in their room by their figures, their toys, their posters, their wallpaper, so on and so forth. I actually
That's an interesting concept.
I know. I just gave away $1 million idea. But I still have, and I don't have it up right now because we just moved part of the house around, but my mom saved my 1978, saved like a part of a roll of the wallpaper. And so I put it and got it cased into a frame. And so now I have a frame of that wallpaper.
Oh, nice.
From Star Wars: A New Hope. that still means a lot to me. I still keep that, and I'll take that with me everywhere I go. But it just looking back at that and thinking, I had 2 walls out of my room in that wallpaper, right? I mean, I had a shower curtain that was that. I had everything, trash cans and night lights and everything. So it's really weird to think today. Well, I gotta wonder, what are kids putting in the room? Is it Fortnite? Is it what is it they're filling their bedrooms with? Like
Yeah, I mean, it's probably not The Last Jedi and Rise of Skywalker, just because and not disparaging. I think Last Jedi is a masterpiece, but you don't have that all-encompassing merchandise. There's a lot of merchandise, but in the 80s, George Lucas said yes to everything.
Yep.
I don't know if you can get a BB-8 toothbrush like I used to be able to get a selection. I could have Wicket, a Gamorrean Guard. I could have a Bib Fortuna toothbrush if I wanted. I remember all these things. I don't think it's quite there anymore because there was no other. There was no other massive pop culture franchise. There was no competition. Star Wars exploded, and there was nothing else that came close. These days, there's Marvel and everything else.
So, I agree with you 100%. And to think that we can now talk about your book that you've put together based off of all the timelines you've put together, just blows me away that not only was there all that merchandise, but there's all these stories. There's all these little ins and outs about characters who you maybe saw for a few minutes in the movie, or just future later in the cartoons, what have you. But it amazes me that there was that much content, that not only do we have a new timeline since Disney bought it, but we have an entire timeline that goes, well, I'm looking at your book right here, and when you add all of from your forward until the Clone Wars timeline notes, 621 pages.
It's chunky.
And I look at it and I'm thinking to myself, okay, there were parts of it where I was like, okay, I didn't stick with that, right? I fell out of this or that, whether it was some of the old Jedi, the ancient history stuff didn't fit for me, right? But then Star Wars Legacy, which was all the way at the end, was some of my favorite new Star Wars. When that came out, I thought, my gosh, that was just an incredible new storyline with a bunch of different directions in it. And so to see you put this all together from that ancient history until Legacy just blows me away. And I like that you also had to separate out the Clone Wars timeline with the Clone Wars timeline notes.
There's just no other way to do it. I know we were all kind of promised that when the Clone Wars animated show started, the 3D one, we were promised that this would make sense and they'd make it fit. But it's round peg, square hole. It was never going to fit. And there is no point frustrating yourself, ultimately, trying to make it fit, trying to force retcons or excuses or headcanon, when it's easier to just go, you know what, swipe it over there. It's a third timeline. You've got the EU, you've got the Legends Clone Wars, and you've got canon. So really now there are 3 timelines, and that's the easiest way to do it.
Do you, as we're talking about timelines, do you ever see Star Wars doing what Marvel is doing with the multiverse kind of setup, to where I know they're doing it with Lego.
Yes, and I think that's their out, is that they can do things like Lego and Visions and say, this isn't Star Wars, it's its own thing, which is exciting. It allows creators to play around with the concept, but it doesn't actually change the main canon timeline.
Right. No, I think that's I think there's a possibility for that, and I think it's definitely the way to do it is through those little fun stories on the side, where it doesn't make the people who are, hey, this is the canon and we're going to follow it this way. You can have fun with it and do some odd, different little storylines off to the side that don't make everybody have to retcon everything.
Yes.
So looking back at your book, looking at it, how long did this process take for you to start? Because I know you probably started it actually when you started reading books. So looking at the timeline you've got.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
I've been timelining for maybe 20 years. I've been reading the books since they came out, since the Thrawn trilogy. I was a bit too young to get the early Brian Daley stuff. I remember over in the UK we had the Lost Jedi Adventure game book came out around the same time as the Thrawn trilogy, so I was really on board. And then you live the same journey. You start getting more and more books, but the chronology was pretty standard. Every time you got a new book, it was 2 years after the last one or 3 years after the one before. And it wasn't until we started hitting sort of the late 90s that we started getting the gaps filled. And you have things like Rebel Dawn or the Han Solo trilogy or Crimson Empire with that flashback to the events of Dark Empire. And then Chris McElroy's Time Tales came along, which is a fascinating timeline. I remember printing that off at work, and it must have been 400 pages because I was just obsessed by this. And then I started keeping my own track, which is just simple Excel spreadsheets. Been doing that forever. And then Corey, CEO of Utini, put an advert out for people to come work for the site a while back, and I literally spammed him, sent him all my spreadsheets, and went, I'm your guy. I'm the guy to do this. Then I started doing the timeline there. And then I went to Celebration. I had an opportunity to go to Celebration in 2022. Utini had a booth and a panel, which was incredible. And I was like, I can't miss this opportunity. And my wife amazingly said, you can't not go. So with like 3 weeks notice, I went over to Celebration, met a couple of the Timelines authors for the Star Wars Timelines canon book that came out, one of whom said they'd referenced our Utini timeline in their research for the book.
Wow.
I was hyperventilating in the corner. It was messy. And I came back so inspired. I'm like, I've done all this work. If I've put the work in, I want to print this. And then as I'm going through the process, the book went through so many iterations. There's people out there with early versions of a printed timeline that's about 50 pages long. As I'm going through, I'm diving deep. You mentioned the Old Republic. I'm not a big player. I've never played the game. I've read the books. I've read the comics. That era never really grabbed me. So I had to do a lot of research to make that work. How am I going to put the game in? And then you start researching all the different character chapters. Then I started looking at the codex. That was a ton of research just to put that in order. So I could be, call it definitive. But the more I researched, the more I started splitting stories, like by chapter or by parts. And then it just got more and more and more and more to the point in my head, I was like, I've started this journey. I can't bail out now.
Right.
So when it gets to the movies and I'm splitting books, not just by chapters, but by paragraph parts, and then inserting the radio dramas, and then inserting the Star Wars Tales comics or stuff from Manga Black, and all of that, that's when the vision came in and went, this is going to be definitive. This is going to be the ultimate resource. If you want to pick your favorite battle, movie, era, character, you'll be able to follow all this stuff using the footnotes where things overlap. And you may also find stories you didn't know existed, which is kind of the secondary purpose of the book. It's not just a timeline. There's timelines on the internet. But it's to really shine a light on all these other passages, whether it's in the West End Games source books, whether it's the stuff that was printed online for the Mythos statuette range.
Right.
Stories that maybe you just weren't aware of. Now you can go and hunt them down and enjoy them.
I did start noticing that. I was scrolling through it, and I was, amazed at how many of the things I was like, yes, I've read this, I've read that. And then I would come across something that would be like chapter this in this book, and it happened in place in this timeline. And I started thinking to myself, I don't even know where that book is. I've never heard of that, or I've never heard of that short story, or, what have you. And I love that you had those short stories and those little bits of things you had even in universe documents like you have,
yes,
which I thought was fantastic, because, we do find characters reading things and seeing things in these stories that lay down parts of the timeline, right? Or the continuity. So,
well, you've got the Holonet news articles from Insider and StarWars.com.
Yep.
They're perfect pieces of media to slot them. They occur on a day. It was broadcast on a specific day. It's easy to anchor other stories around.
Right.
So you have to include them. And then when I started looking at the Old Republic Codex, originally I never planned to put them on because there's hundreds of them. And some are just your average collectibles. It's just descriptive text. But some are new fiction. Some are a paragraph or two of new narrative. And then you've got all the in-universe documents within that.
Right.
Once I knew I was adding them, I didn't know what I'd got myself into.
So I have to ask, before you jumped into working with Utini, before you jumped into creating this, what was your background? Were you an author, a writer? What was your professional background that made you have this connectivity to this, or is there connectivity to it?
Oh, no connection at all. I manage supermarkets. I'm a retailer. But like I said, I've always kept a spreadsheet. And it's just got more detailed as the years have gone on. There will be people possibly watching this, listening to this, who have copies of my spreadsheets from 15 years ago.
Wow.
I've had a few people message me on Twitter going, I've still got such and such a spreadsheet. And I'm thinking, it's moved on a lot since then. I mean, Legends has been over it's not been over for 10 years. There's been new Legends, but for all intents and purposes, it's 10 years. So I've had 10 years to refine this spreadsheet.
So looking back at it, I know I asked you, like, how long did it take you? But it sounds like you made a concerted decision back in 2022 to say,
yes,
I'm going to wrap this up and put this into a book. From that time till how long were you doing that to say, okay, now it's at the point I'm ready to get this published?
It's been most of those 2 years. I probably dropped it for about 4 months when I was really focusing on my canon timeline because I can't stop. The High Republic really suckered me in, so I was doing that a lot. But yeah, it's been pretty much 2 years of solid work, not just the research, but the compiling it into the format that it is now in. And also I had to reread or reskim pretty much every single story that I've referenced because I couldn't base it off the spreadsheet I've been using all along, because what if it was wrong?
Mm-hmm.
What if I'd made a mistake somewhere? And my earlier spreadsheets never went deep into chapters or lots of that. So yeah, two solid years. And then I finished it pretty much a week before I posted it on Twitter. And I wasn't expecting this to explode as it has. I just put it on Twitter going, hey, guys, I've made a book. I've been working on it for 2 years. My phone started pinging a bit, and then I went to bed, and my phone had practically melted by the next morning. That original tweet has like nearly 400,000 impressions and
Wow.
reposted nearly 1,000 times. I was expecting maybe 20 or 30 of the real
Sure.
uber timeline nerds to be like, oh, that's impressive, and everyone else to go, okay, that's a bit much. But no, it turns out that there really is an audience for it.
There really is. And one of the discussions we have in our podcast is Legends, and the EU part of Legends was one of the reasons why there was a lot of not confrontation, but different ways of looking at the sequel trilogy, because Luke was such a key part of the Legends books, right? Like post Return of the Jedi, Luke made up such a huge portion of the Legends, and you saw him in almost this superhero form because we didn't know what a true Jedi could be, right? Like when we wanted to focus it on, the books a lot of times wanted to focus it on how great Luke went on to become with the Academy and what he did in the past or the future past Return of the Jedi. And so when people saw him in the sequel trilogy, a lot of times people were going head to head of, that's not the Luke that I know, or that's not the Luke that I expected us to see, right? So it is, for all the people who say one thing or the other about the sequel trilogy, I still think the EU plays a big part in some of the views and points of the sequel trilogy, because how many millions of people were expecting it to be, either a new Jedi Order or a Thrawn series or a something like that, where we get to see superhero Luke for 2 or 3 movies, right? Maybe die and fade off in the sunset in some glorious, huge battle, right? And it didn't come 100% to that fruition. So I think a lot of people looked at it as the EU, all these 400,000 people who commented or whatever on your post, that it was ingrained in their head. The EU was ingrained in their head, is what I was looking at. Do you think there's anything like that at all?
Yeah, no, completely. And listen, I love canon. I love what Disney have done with Star Wars. Ultimately, Disney have given us more Star Wars.
Yeah.
That's the bottom line. Is we wouldn't have the Acolyte, we wouldn't have Andor, we wouldn't have Mando, and they couldn't carry on the EU. It was just, this book alone will show you how unwieldy, how complex, how contradictory the EU was. They couldn't possibly have carried on that story. So wiping the slate clean, I think, was the only option available to them. I think that's the absolute sensible thing to do. And, listen, but these stories aren't deleted. You can still go buy them. You can still go read them. Nothing was cancelled. It was just, listen, we can't carry that on. It's just too much. Because if they'd attempted to carry on the EU, we'd 10 years down the line, we'd still be like, yes, but in that source book, this happened and you've overruled it. I mean, can you imagine?
Well, we just saw in the Acolyte with the age of Ki-Adi-Mundi, correct?
Yeah.
I mean, people were losing their mind over it.
Complete nonsense.
Yeah. So, I was of the age to where the legends meant so much to me that it was very hard for a short period of time to get over. It was very difficult to think these things that I've grown to love and that have been filling my Star Wars void for X amount of years in canon were kind of null and void. I've grown past that. I've gone past that to where I see there's plenty of new and different Star Wars out there. And I think one of the things that's given me hope is they're now piecemealing and taking some of the best or some of the things that make sense from that Legends and trying to blend it in to what we see as canon now, right? Take the best of the best.
So they're taking, they're taking some of the best. They're taking some of the most recognizable, like Thrawn. They've also given us more Jaxxon. So come on. I mean, I'm all in.
Right there.
Exactly. There you go.
I got him right in front of me. I got Jaxxon right there.
We actually did a whole episode on Jaxxon on the Star Wars Archives, and my entire point was to prove conclusively that his story is perfect from Legends to canon. Nothing is broken. He transfers both timelines. He is the one that brings Star Wars all together. Because when Cavan Scott writes him, he's obviously a direct sequel to the Legends stories. It's fantastic.
Well, we had Cavan on as a guest a while back, and one of the reasons that he came on, I think, and we can double check with him, but when I was messaging him and asking him to be a guest, I was like, come on, you can come on, you can talk about anything Jaxxon you want. We are a pro Jaxxon, we're a pro Jaxxon podcast. So so looking at your timeline again, 640 or so pages when you add acknowledgments and forwards and introductions, but really the meat of it is that actual timeline. So looking at, I thought when you sent over a version for me to check out and look at real quick, I thought how is this going to be laid out? I wanted to see, and I love it that it's not something where I have to get too deep into the meatiness of anything. I can scan through, I can see dates, I can see either chapters or paragraphs or books or what have you, timeline, date, boom, boom, when they came out, all that stuff. It's great. Bullet point. It's almost like something to where I want to take it and take a highlighter to the inside of the book and go, yes, I read that. Yes, I read that. I need to fill in the gap by reading this, right?
Absolutely. People should do that. People should use it as a checklist. I only added the sources in the back because I had a couple of people say, you should do that. And that was at the very end of a project. I'm like, I don't want to go through and source every single short story or vignette that I put in here. But you're right. You can just scan it. You can't just pick your favorite era and just go, yeah, I've read that. And you'll be remembering those stories as you go through. So even though you're looking up this page, your brain is actually reliving those stories as you go through. And I think it gives, if you've read a lot, I think it gives you a really unique perspective as you do it. But then I've also had people message me and go, I'm just starting my Legends journey and I've just ordered your book. I'm like, that's a terrible idea. That's just, do not read it in this order. That's insanity. Not first time round.
Not a good idea. Not a good idea.
No.
We have hope. Hope that things will get better. And they will. Especially since you're listening to Rule the Galaxy podcast.
So sorry about the short delay there, folks. We're back here with Trevor. We're going to keep going on the timeline book that he had, the definitive Star Wars Legends timeline. Trevor, real quick before we talk a little bit more about the book, you mentioned the timelines being online and things like that. Are they at utini.com, or are there other locations where you keep them to where people can check these kind of things?
No, so if you go to the utini.com/timelines, we've got timelines on there for Legends and canon. They're the most beautiful timelines on the internet. They're nowhere near as detailed as this book. There's a much more basic chronological timeline. Sure. But every book, comic, video game is on there. But you can choose your era, and then you can just filter by preference. So if you're someone who only reads the adult novels, only reads the comics, you can filter by that. And then you can include your YA, your junior books, your video games, your TV, your movies, your short stories, everything you want. So you can cater for your preferences. My Legends timeline, I've never really uploaded a spreadsheet anywhere, but I have started a Substack for my canon timeline, which is just as insane as this one. It is possibly more insane because the canon Marvel comics love their flashbacks. I don't think you get a single issue where there isn't a flashback. So all of that, and again, chapter by chapter, books broken down day by day. So you can find that at substack.com/Davey Todd. They're all out there.
Well, I definitely don't want to push people to go to those before they go and purchase this, because I think, like you said, those timelines, I'm sure, are nice and neat and clean, but they're not going to be as detailed as this one right here. So looking at it, I'm just scrolling through here. And like I said, we discussed a little bit about Legacy. We discussed a little bit about the Marvel comics, things like that. Those are like, I grew up living the Marvel comics. That was my go-to, right? And then, like I said, Splinter of the Mind's Eye, Brian Daley's Han Solo trilogy, those are actually all right behind me right there. Is there a favorite part of the Legends universe for you when you were either reading it or looking at it in this timeline that really stands out to you?
I love the Marvel comics. They're insane. They're some of my earliest memories of Star Wars storytelling. Obviously, I've got a fondness for the 90s, and as you went from the Bantam era into Del Rey. But honestly, for me, I think the peak Star Wars Legends novels were the early 2000s. The Clone Wars multimedia project, between Attack of the Clones, Revenge of the Sith, I think we saw some of the best novels there. That's also leading into Phantom Menace, the kind of unofficial now trilogy of Cloak of Deception going into Darth Maul, Shadowhunter, going into Darth Plagueis, throw Lockdown into the mix as well. It becomes its own new book. I actually did this for myself a couple of years ago, edited all of those into one big book.
Wow.
With things like the Wrath of Darth Maul and the Episode 1 Adventures, to have like the full kind of omnibus Darth Plagueis expanded edition. And it is like a whole new book. James Luceno did such a job with that book of referencing all these other stories and reading them. That's for one part of this timeline's book. But if anyone was going to read in chronological order, it would be anything to do with Darth Plagueis and those characters and those other books that I just mentioned, because it works perfectly.
Interesting. What's funny is I talk about it, and I've talked about it recently on the Acolyte. I've talked about it in looking at other live action shows that have come out. I've talked about it with the movies, the books. I am always the hero fan. Like my heroes are the heroes, right? Like
Yep.
it's
Luke
very
Skywalker is my favorite character.
There you go. So, for me, looking at Luke Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi and the selflessness, the just the moral qualities about those two characters, it just hits me. Well, and Captain Rex, believe it or not, I feel like he's very similar, but just not a Jedi, right? They have this moral compass about them that points them in a certain direction. Do they veer off of it? Sure, everybody does, but I still feel like so. For me, I never read for years anyway the Plagueis novel, and for years
Okay.
I didn't read the Darth Bane novels, and the reason
Yeah.
is I was like, I just can't see myself wanting to go to that darker view, right? And now Plagueis, Bane, those characters, those books are as important to me as the Thrawn trilogy, as some of these other books that you've mentioned out there. Right? I could read. I reread the Thrawn trilogy every year, and now I reread Plagueis, and I try to reread the Bane trilogy every year because they just hit me the right way. And it's so funny because being that not want to look at it from the dark side, not wanting to not follow the hero. Those books were ones where I was like, I don't want to do it, but I finally did, and I just see how important they are and how just great, how well they were written by Drew Karpyshyn and by James Luceno, as you said. But it's amazing how those stand out to me now, which I didn't read them when they first came out all those years ago.
I mean, Plagueis is such a cornerstone, and it's books like that that I've always kind of encouraged my timeline, because or anybody's timeline, you're seeing events that but you're seeing them from somebody stood behind the curtain. You're seeing them from a completely different point of view. So when you throw all those things into the mix, that's what really broadens the saga. But that's what the books and the comics do best.
When when you were looking at this, were there more? What was the hardest part of putting this book together? Was it, as you mentioned, the in-universe stuff? Was it finding those old things from the 70s, the 80s, so on and so forth, putting that in there? Or was it when we got this massive media blow from the 90s through to the 2000s and early 2000s? Which was there a part that was more difficult to put together than others?
Oh, there's a couple that were really, really tricky. So for the movies, for example, I've broken them down day by day, so you know where they come. But certain books have different ideas. So, for example, Tales from Jabba's Palace, the Dengar story in particular, seems to add an extra day into the events of Return of the Jedi, but it isn't referenced by any other story. It's just a day of them all sat around doing nothing in between Leia getting captured and Luke rescuing them. But that's where the footnotes come in. This book would be nothing without the footnotes explaining some of that stuff. If there's any regret I've got, it's that I didn't go even more insane in the footnotes, give even more knowledge. But, page counts exist. There's only so much I could do.
Right.
The Battle of Yavin was tough. The battle itself, because there's so many stories, so many video game levels. And then you have to determine, okay, but which one adds something new? Which one is just a replica of the trench run, or which one has a new mission? So one of the X-Wing missions is a pre-Battle of Yavin mission to take out some satellites to stop some communications as the Death Star's on approach. That's new.
Right.
But 200 different versions of a trench run isn't new. And I make this really clear in my kind of introduction to the book. This is just my interpretation. Other people may disagree on some of the placements, but I've done the research. But it also meant that freed me up to say, well, I'm making a stand and I'm saying this is the case, such as how long is the time jump in The Empire Strikes Back? How long did it take them to get to Bespin? How long was Luke on Dagobah? It's always been nebulous.
Yes.
But for something like this, especially when that year in particular, you've got the Ewoks cartoons going on, you've got the TIE Fighter video game going on, you've got all these other things in that year, you've got Shadows of the Empire. You have to nail down how long you're going to allow Luke to be on Dagobah and not clash with anything else. I think I settled on, I'd have to go back and double check. I think I settled on 8 weeks, because certain years I've mapped out, like I said, I've done the movies by the days. There's certain years with so much going on, they're mapped out by the month. So the year before the Battle of Yavin, the year after the Battle of Yavin is split by month. 3 ABY is split by month. I think a couple of the Clone Wars years, again, I can't remember. There's a lot to remember. Some of those are split by month. Where I could do it, I did do it. If I couldn't do it, then there'd at least still be a footnote or something in the middle column saying this is 4 months after Battle of Geonosis, or it nearly drove me mad.
Well, that's what gets me is I sit there and I think to myself, I've been doing a podcast now since January of 2020, and we're 279 episodes in. And I think to myself, my gosh, the amount of time and effort I've put into this is amazing. And then I talk to someone like you and I think, well, I've got the easy part of this. I just have to share a few talking points with some of my co-hosts, maybe watch the show that's out or read something that's out and then go talk about it. You have to have this minute by minute, day by day, month by month put together, whether it's in the canons or the legends now. So that seems like a big undertaking. Do you ever feel like you're just going to say, I'm finished with this. I've reached my point. Like, is this definitive enough on the legend side where you feel like I don't have to go and redo this in a few years, obviously with them not really making new legends material?
I don't think there's much more I can do with the legends, although as luck would have it, a week after I published it and set it out there, somebody had translated some really rare German Ewok short stories that had appeared in a magazine in the 80s. I was like, where was this a week ago? And I'm there's a big The Old Republic update coming soon, so I'm half expecting there to be a new short story on their website. I'm not sure if there's ever going to be enough new content or rediscovered content to warrant a second edition. And so far, I haven't had, dozens of angry people going, you got this wrong, you got that wrong. So whether it needs a second edition, I don't know.
If you would have told me before you and I spoke that we would talk about a German Ewoks short story from the 80s, I would not have believed you. That is absolutely crazy to think about. I was at weird age. I was 13 when Return of the Jedi came out, and you're changing from a young kid to a young man, and so Ewoks didn't hit perfect with me at that time. But I tell you what, they've definitely grown in my appreciation over the last 40 years. I now look at the Ewoks in between the movies, the animated series, the books that that were related to that. Just some really fun times. And I think more than anything for me, it's I look forward to having some of that old Ewok stuff that I had from that time frame and giving it to, again, the grandkids to say, hey, this is fun stuff that might draw you in. It's fun and kid kind of, but it brings you into the overall story. So
I'm a massive fan of the Ewoks, but obviously I'm a handful of years younger than you, so I think the Ewoks cartoon was probably more my thing when it came out. But again, you've not just got, there's probably a dozen original kids books to do with the Ewoks that came out in the 80s, plus you've got the comic strips that came out from Star Comics. You've got so that year, that 3 ABY year, for Ewoks alone, there's a lot of stuff going on.
So we talked a little bit about a handful of topics. One of the biggest things that came out that really kind of blew my wife away and my kids away and things like that was when the new Jedi Order series came out.
Yeah.
And we're talking
Loved it.
about. I did too. I was completely enthralled with that series. Did it have its ups and downs? Sure. Every
Yeah.
thing, especially that massive, would. But I really found myself diving headfirst into that. How much content in this book? How much do you feel like you took just out of that? What 19 book series?
So
Um,
so one of the most fun parts was something that had been in my head this whole time since since the series had finished, but I'd never knuckled down to do it. Was the chronological split between Enemy Lines 1 and 2, Traitor, and Dark Journey, because they all kind of happen at the same time. But in a book like this, I can't write, oh yeah, these happened at the same time. I have to go more in depth. So that was a really interesting part of the project to revisit, because I wanted to get it right and looking for the clues within each book. And then you've got all the short stories, the Boba Fett, A Practical Man, that starts before Vector Prime, ends shortly after, but also there's enough going on, but I had to split it. You've got Emissary of the Void, which goes along with the Edge of Victory books, but ends just before a specific battle in that book. So again, then you're tracking the passage of time in both the book and the short story, so you can split in the chapters. You've got a couple of things from a Tales comics, obviously the Invasion comics, which never really fitted, but how do I make that work? There's enough there. If you look deep in any era, really,
sure.
There's enough there to make it more interesting. Also, you had a couple of passages in either Jedi versus Sith, the Essential Guide to the Force, and Essential Guide to Warfare. There's so much in those two reference books alone, spanning, generations, hundreds, thousands of years of in-universe documents or recordings, as I call them, from the Jedi versus Sith book. All of those had to happen at some point. And if they're referencing the events of a book, then it kind of makes sense for something to go after that book. So yeah, it's never as simple as just read these 19 books.
No, not at all. I mean, again, I would think it'd be a huge undertaking to just read through them, you documenting them, splicing them up, chronology, putting the timeline together. Just a huge undertaking. I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around it right now. I think I have adult attention deficit syndrome because I can't focus. I do much better having 9 different things going on at once. For you to really get locked in and focus on this just blows me away.
I think I must be broken.
What are some of your other favorite parts of putting this together, whether it was stories or parts of the timeline or things you found and research that you didn't know, just some other added things that people will need to know about the time and the effort you put into this? What are some other things related to this book that you'd want to tell people about?
So one of what could possibly be called a controversial decision is that I reordered some of the final issues of the Marvel comic run. So I think from maybe issue 92 to 107.
Okay.
Obviously, it was cut short. It meant to go on for longer. The story was wrapped up. But there were stories that kind of happened where the main storyline would just stop. And then there'd be a whole new adventure for Luke. And then the storyline would start again. And I had no intention of doing this. And I think I just kind of twigged one day that if I moved, say for example, there you go, perfect.
Yeah.
Say, for example, I moved 104 in between 101 and 102. Not only did it solve a continuity issue, it actually flowed better. So I was like, well, this is going back to me saying there are times when I've made a call. He said, right, it makes more sense for this story to happen there as opposed to it being a straight chronology. So that was one of those cases where I kind of solved a problem I didn't know existed. And I was really happy with the outcome. Finding new bits of fiction is always great. Things like the most recent one I found, and again, this must be maybe 2 or 3 years ago I found it. It's just doing random research and realizing there was a in-universe communication from Grand Moff Tarkin about the Death Star, that was on the website for the Lethal Alliance game on the Sony PSP and Nintendo Game Boy. Great. Love that. Right. Where am I going to put it?
Wow. That's amazing. Yeah. So I have Mark Newbold from Bantha Tracks and Making Tracks, and then Scott Rifen, who did a podcast, my Star Wars story. Both great guys, but they love the Marvel comics. I definitely want to make sure they know about getting this book, because for them to see it with you breaking things down and all that, I think they will love that. And I have to wonder if some of that stuff at the end, like you said, between the 90s and the 100s of those, what they'll think about that, because they're religious about it. Like, they love the Marvel comics. So it's
But there are ways. So if I use Jawas of Doom, which is historically, doesn't fit because it's the second time or the first time that Boba Fett escaped the Sarlacc before falling back in. But there's, again, I can't remember the specific page numbers, but I'm pretty sure I put a split after page 4. So the first 4 pages of the story happen. Then loads of other stuff happens, like the Truce of Bakura. Then you come back to the story, and it flows. You have to take things with a pinch of salt. You have to kind of suspend your disbelief a bit, but it's all fiction. It's all fake. But if you kind of do it that way, it works better than trying to make those mental gymnastics in the first place.
I tell you what, I'm just blown away, and I've enjoyed the snippets you've given me here to look through. I've enjoyed doing this. Like I said, for me, it's a history book. It's a checklist. It's a refresher on what to read, what not, what I haven't read, all those kind of things. And it's a memory book, because it's taking me back to all those stories that I've read all throughout the years, and plus learning about Ewoks and German stories from the 80s. This is something that I think anybody who was reading books, looking at comics, playing video games, all those kind of things, watching animated series from the 70s through the early 2000s, or since when the new canon started, there's something in here for everybody to be able to take and use in their own personal timeline. So I can't believe all the work you've done on it. I guess what I'll ask you is, what is the easiest way for people to purchase this book and get it to where they can start using it as their own personal guideline and timeline tool?
It's on Amazon. I never expected to put it there. Like I said, I just tweeted out. I put it on Lulu for myself, tweeted out. So many people asking me, so I've put it on Amazon. So yeah, it's on there. The Definitive Legends timeline. It's available as a paperback and a Kindle. I will say I only did the Kindle version because people asked for it. I don't think there's any substitution for being able to hold this book in your hands, flick between the timeline and the footnotes, which you can't do as easily digitally. I am also working on a hardcover simply because I've had people asking for it. So that's going to be coming soon as well.
Well, good. Well, one, it was a pleasure meeting you. I'm really glad that our paths
Thanks for having me.
Yes, I'm very excited. I hope that you and I let's reconnect and maybe talk about the canon side of things, and see if there's new fun things in there that some of us aren't seeing or knowing about, and things like that. But where's the best place for people to follow you? Where? Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, whatever you want to put.
So I'm on Twitter at Davey Todd, so that's DAVEYTOD. I'm on Substack, same place, at Davey Todd, or you can find me in the Utini Discord. I'm quite active in there, utini.com/Discord. And again, if you're only a partial timeline fan, you're looking for an easy-to-use day-to-day timeline for your Legends and canon needs, then check out utini.com. If you like the look of this book, there are some preview pages on my Twitter or on Reddit, again, at Davey Todd. Check it out for yourself before diving in to see exactly how insane it is.
No, it's, hey, all kudos to you, a tip of the cap, because not everybody can do this kind of legwork, and I really appreciate you doing it, and I appreciate you taking the time to be on the Rule of the Galaxy podcast. Like I said, our paths will cross again. We'll have other things to talk about, and I'm going to connect you with Mark and Scott, because I think they would love to talk to you about this. But To all the Star Wars fans out there, make sure go to Amazon, get the definitive Star Wars Legends timeline by Trevor Davey. It's been a pleasure. It's a great book. You'll have fun with it, and you'll use it as your own personal guideline. I promise you, as to what you've read, what you haven't read, and you'll find there's more stories out there than you ever thought there were. So thanks again, and until next time, may the Force be with you.